Long ago in the land of Egypt, a nation cried out for help. Beaten, broken, enslaved, the Israelites, God's chosen people, had become captives under a cruel Pharaoh. In a time when darkness seemed to reign and hope had nearly faded, the cries of a suffering people rose like incense to the heavens. Enslaved, beaten, and forgotten by the world, the Israelites groaned under the weight of Pharaoh's cruel hand. But their pain did not go unnoticed. But while the world saw their pain, God saw a plan. A baby hidden in a basket was about to change everything. Because the God of Abraham still remembered his promise. The God who watches over nations and whispers in deserts had already set in motion a rescue plan, one that would shake an empire and forge a nation. This is the story of Moses, a man raised in royalty, shaped by the desert, and chosen by God to confront kings, part seas, and lead an entire nation to freedom. The shepherd of God's people, the voice before Pharaoh, the receiver of the law, and the shadow of a greater deliverer to come. More than a hero, Moses was a servant of God, a leader not by strength, but by obedience. Through him, we see how God uses the weak, empowers the humble, and fulfills his promises in mighty ways. Join us as we dive into the powerful story of Moses, the man who walked with God and led his people to freedom. A journey of faith and fear, weakness and wonder, miracles and mistakes. A story that reveals the heart of a God who hears, who acts, and who still calls ordinary people to do extraordinary things through his power. A deliverer is born. Long before the name Moses was ever whispered, long before miracles and mountains, there was only pain, a nation groaning under the weight of chains in a foreign land. The Israelites, once honored guests in Egypt during Joseph's day, had become slaves under a cruel and paranoid Pharaoh. For centuries, they toiled in silence, their backs bent under heavy labor, their hearts crushed beneath the weight of oppression. In a time of deep suffering, when hope seemed lost and the cries of pain rose from a nation in chains, God was silently preparing a man who would change history. The whips cracked, babies cried, fathers labored until their bodies broke, mothers wept silently as their sons were taken. But heaven was not silent. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Exodus 2:24. Though the people couldn't see him, God was moving. Even in the darkness, he was preparing a man, a deliverer, a shepherd of his people. The Israelites, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had once entered Egypt as honored guests during Joseph's time. But now, hundreds of years later, they were slaves, harshly oppressed under the hand of a new Pharaoh who feared their growing numbers. The Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. Exodus 1:12-14. They cried out to God, and God, ever faithful, heard their groaning and remembered his covenant. But before deliverance would come, a leader needed to rise, one molded by divine design. And so in the midst of a death decree against Hebrew baby boys, a child was born who would carry the destiny of a nation. The making of a leader, Exodus 2. Moses' life began with courage and faith. His mother, Jochebed, seeing that he was no ordinary child, hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she placed him in a basket and set it afloat on the Nile. By divine providence, Pharaoh's daughter discovered the child and raised him as her own. Ironically, the future deliverer of Israel was raised in the very palace of the oppressor. Moses grew up with the best of Egypt's education and wealth, but his heart remained tied to his people. One day, Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. In a moment of passion and justice, he killed the Egyptian, but his action was found out. Fearing for his life, he fled to the desert of Midian. For 40 years, Moses was forgotten by Egypt, but not by God. He married Zipporah, tended sheep, and walked the quiet paths of humility. The wilderness became God's classroom. It was there God stripped away the prince and raised up a prophet. The call of God, Exodus 3-4. One day, while tending sheep near Mount Horeb, Moses saw something strange, a bush burning with fire, yet not consumed. As he approached, God called out from the fire. "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," he replied. Exodus 3:4. God declared his purpose. "I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt, so now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Exodus 3:7-10. And God responded not with rebuke, but with reassurance. "I will be with you." Exodus 3:12. Despite doubts, fears, and feelings of inadequacy, God patiently reassured him. He gave Moses signs. His staff would turn into a snake, his hand would become leprous and heal, and promised to send Aaron to speak on his behalf. God wasn't looking for the perfect speaker. He was looking for obedience. Confronting Pharaoh, Exodus 5-12. Moses returned to Egypt, now God's prophet. Together with Aaron, he stood before Pharaoh and boldly declared, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go." Exodus 5:1. Pharaoh scoffed, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him?" So began a dramatic showdown, not between Moses and Pharaoh, but between God and the false gods of Egypt. God unleashed 10 powerful plagues. Water turned to blood, frogs overran the land, gnats, flies, livestock disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally, the death of the firstborn. The final plague broke Pharaoh's resistance. The Israelites were protected by the blood of the Bay Passover lamb, a powerful symbol of the future salvation through Christ. That very night, after 430 years in Egypt, God's people marched out as a free nation. Through the sea to freedom, Exodus 14. But Pharaoh's heart hardened once more. He chased them to the Red Sea. Trapped between water and an army, the people cried out. Moses answered, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord." Exodus 14:13. Moses lifted his staff. The sea split. Walls of water stood on either side. The Israelites crossed on dry ground. Egypt followed and was swallowed. The people stood in awe. They were not just freed, they were delivered by the hand of God. This miracle sealed Moses' role not just as a prophet, but as a leader of liberation. A God who provides, Exodus 15-17. The wilderness was not a wasteland. It was a classroom of trust as the Israelites stepped out of Egypt's shadow and into the vast wilderness. Their chains were gone, but so was their comfort. They quickly found themselves in a barren land where faith, not familiarity, would sustain them. The sun scorched their skin, the sand burned their feet, and almost immediately, fear set in. What will we eat? Where will we find water? Did Moses bring us here to die? They forgot the Red Sea had just opened before them. They forgot the plagues that had shaken Egypt. But God did not forget them. In their weakness, God proved himself as Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides. Manna from heaven, Exodus 16. One morning as the dew lifted from the camp, The ground was covered with thin flakes, heavenly bread, unlike anything they'd ever seen. It was called manna, meaning, "What is it?" Each morning everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. Exodus 16:21. God fed them daily, but with a lesson. They couldn't store it. They had to trust Him each day for their portion. Man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Deuteronomy 8:3. Water from the rock. Exodus 17:1-7. Later, when their lips were dry and their spirits bitter, they cried out for water. Moses, under pressure, turned to God, and God answered, not with rain, but with a miracle from stone. Moses struck a rock, and life-giving water poured out. I will stand before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. Exodus 17:6. Even in dryness, God can make rivers flow. Victory through worship. Exodus 17:8-13. When Amalek attacked, God showed that victory wouldn't come from swords, but from surrendered hands. As long as Moses raised his hands to heaven, Israel prevailed. When he lowered them, they began to lose. Aaron and Hur stood beside him, holding up his arms, a picture of community and spiritual support. The battle was won through faith, not force. Through worship, not weapons. Each of these moments in the wilderness revealed something deeper: God's faithfulness in uncertainty, God's presence in desolation, God's power in the face of enemies. The wilderness wasn't a punishment. It was a sacred journey of learning to depend fully on God. And so it is with us. When we lack, when we thirst, when we battle, He is still the God who provides. Covenant and leadership. Exodus 19-24. 3 months later, they arrived at Mount Sinai. Their God revealed Himself in thunder and fire and gave Moses the B'ed, 10 commandments, laws that would shape Israel's identity. You shall have no other gods before me. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. Exodus 20. And God said, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession. Exodus 19:5. Moses spent 40 days on the mountain in God's presence. He became Israel's mediator, speaking to God on their behalf. There, Moses received the 10 commandments, laws of love, worship, and justice. God wasn't just freeing them. He was forming a people for Himself, a heart of intercession. Exodus 32-34. While Moses was on the mountain, the people grew impatient and made a golden calf. God's anger burned against them, but Moses pleaded, "But now, please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." Exodus 32:32. His prayer revealed a heart like Christ's, willing to stand in the gap for sinners. God forgave them, and His presence remained with Israel. The final years, Numbers and Deuteronomy. God gave instructions for a tabernacle, a place where He would dwell among them. Moses met with God face to face. His face shone with glory. And yet because of disobedience, the people wandered for 40 years. Moses led the people for 40 years through the wilderness. He dealt with complaints, rebellions, and hardships. Still, Moses led faithfully, teaching, judging, praying, and guiding, but also witnessed daily miracles, manna from heaven, water from rocks, and God's guidance. But one moment of anger, striking a rock instead of speaking, cost him the promised land. Even faithful leaders fall short, but God's grace remains. Though he longed to enter the promised land, God did not allow it because of one act of disobedience, Numbers 20:12. Yet before his death, Moses stood atop Mount Nebo. There, God showed him the land, the inheritance of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have let you see it, but you will not cross over. And Moses died, alone with God, his burial place unknown. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Deuteronomy 34:10. Conclusion: a legacy of faithful leadership. Moses' story is more than a tale of slavery to freedom. It is a journey of God's relentless love and how he raises up flawed but willing people to do mighty things. Moses was begin rescued child turned ruler, against a wandering shepherd turned prophet, against a fearful man turned fearless leader, a servant of God who pointed ahead to Jesus, the greater deliverer. Through Moses, we learn that God calls, equips, walks with, and uses those who trust him. And like Moses, we too are called to lead, to serve, and to stand for justice in the strength of the Lord. Reflection: what is God calling you to do? Are you in the wilderness, feeling forgotten? God is preparing you. Are you afraid of what you lack? God will be with you. Are you facing impossible odds? Stand still and see his salvation. Like Moses, you may feel unqualified. But remember, God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called.